Hello, this is Geotech, and today I'm going to be talking about social media. If I were to ask you, how do you define a social media platform? Do you define it by its features, by the UI, or by the community that uses it? I think this question is especially important when you're considering building alternatives to the mainstream social media platforms. I'll go ahead and break it down for you, and so let's take a look. If you're enjoying my video, you can subscribe to me on YouTube, PeerTube, follow me on Odyssey. You could also support me on LiberaPay, Patreon, and by shopping at Earth Hero. See links in the description below. So to start with Facebook here, Facebook, when it initially came out, like in 2004 or so, was a platform very exclusive for college students, but of course it later expanded to include everyone. And initially it became popular for having text-only posts, photos and albums, videos, sharing links. And then eventually they expanded to events and groups. And I think these features were synonymous with Facebook, and it became the most popular social media platform. And I guess technically, even to this day, it still is. But if I were to ask you, what is Facebook? How would you define it? Would you define it by the features or the UI? Or the kind of community that is there? If I ask you what kind of people are on Facebook, a lot of people will say that, well, Facebook is that platform where your mom, your grandma are on, and they consider it uncool. Eventually, Facebook allowed you to share posts and content from creators with their pages. They eventually added stories, which they copied from Snapchat. And then recently they added dating and marketplace. The marketplace feature is an interesting one because it shows you that now Facebook is expanding to potentially becoming a full-fledged e-commerce website. And then recently, they've become a video hosting platform, essentially competing against YouTube, and also similar to Twitch in that they allow streamers and have gaming on their platform. Eventually, Instagram came along, and what made them unique is that they were a photo sharing platform. They had these really cool filters. This was the unique feature that they had, and they were never intending to compete against Facebook. It was supposed to exist alongside it. And so I think initially it generally attracted photographers and artists. Of course, they eventually expanded to videos and then stories, and then lastly, reels. Then we have Twitter, which started off as a microblogging for text posts with the limit being 140 characters. They, of course, eventually expanded to photos, sharing links or media. And one other unique feature they introduced was hashtags, which every social media platform has copied. They dabbled with stories, aka fleets, which they deprecated. And then recently they've introduced spaces where you can join these sort of voice groups or chats. People use Twitter and still use it as a public forum, whereas in Facebook, you typically would use it to keep in touch with friends and families. Instagram, to a certain degree, people use it that way, but Twitter has always been more of a public forum, and that's part of why there's not as many people on Twitter, because only a specific amount want to take part in like public discussions, especially when you can do the same thing on Facebook. And then of course I'm putting YouTube here because even though YouTube started out as a video platform where you can communicate with people through the comments, they eventually allowed stories for creators and also community posts, aka text posts with polls. And they eventually introduced shorts to copy the popularity of TikTok. Even though it started as a video platform, it's copied a lot of features that are popular on social media platforms. Then of course there's TikTok with their shorts or reels, basically small clips. TikTok is a little bit more popular with the younger generation. I think part of it is because it's the newer platform. Typically your grandma or mom are not on the platform, so it's still considered cool. So as you can see, the features on these platforms shape the UI and thus shape the community. But sometimes people will end up using these platforms for very different reasons. Instagram, for example, started out as a platform for photographers, artists, but now people just use it to share things that they would share on Facebook previously. And honestly, most of the people I follow on Instagram don't even really post that much anymore. They mostly share stories. So even for the intended purpose, people are not actually using it for the photos and filters aspect of it. So if I were to ask you, how do you define Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or YouTube or TikTok? Would you define it by the features, by the community, by the UI? I feel like there's no real way to define them. But it's an interesting question, especially when you're trying to build alternatives to these platforms. Now, when it comes to the alternatives, I think the best way to set up an alternative to these platforms is to create something that is open source, decentralized, and funded by the community. And my personal favorite open source, decentralized, community funded alternatives are Mastodon and PixelFed. Mastodon is more like a Twitter alternative or a microblogging website. It allows text-only posts, photos, sharing of links, while PixelFed, on the other hand, is more like a Instagram alternative where you can share photos, albums, or collections. They even have stories, and you can also share videos. Now, back to my earlier point on how the mainstream social media platforms are starting to become more indefinable. When you consider Mastodon being more like a Twitter alternative, does that mean that they have the exact same features of Twitter? Does that mean that they should introduce other features that are not found on Twitter? And same thing applies to PixelFed. I think both Mastodon and PixelFed are in the process of adding groups to their platforms. PixelFed has been teasing about this for some time now, and so that's going to roll out soon. So at that point, do you consider them more like Facebook? Is that a good thing to move in that direction, or a bad thing? Should both platforms stay only as Twitter or microblogging or photo sharing alternative? That's a big question. I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong answer, but it's something I've been thinking about. I know Mastodon at one point was wrestling with the idea of allowing a markup tools or styles to their posts, but I don't know if it was the creator or just the team of Mastodon decided not to move forward with that direction. But I always wonder, why not add the feature? Not only that, I would even go further and make Mastodon a place for posting blogs. I've been reading recently about how people consume photos and videos. It doesn't really get their brain thinking as much because it does a lot of the imagination for them. Whereas if you read text or read like a long article, it gets your brain working and thinking a lot more because, well, you're imagining what's going on in the text. Not only that, but I think having a blog post element to the platform won't drain resources because it's really just more text. So it'll be like having a built-in medium within Mastodon. And I'm like, well, why not do it? I mean, Twitter is already adding spaces, so now it's becoming something else, something beyond just microblogging. I think most people don't realize this, but there is somewhat of a yearning for a larger character limit. A lot of people post Twitter threads, and I feel like that's a cry out for more characters, or possibly just allowing people to post blog posts. So why not experiment and add more features? It has the benefit of keeping people from having to have different accounts on different platforms, but it has that added convenience factor to it. And let's face it, all the other different social media platforms are copying each other's features. Now, part of it is motivated by money, so that, instead of going to TikTok, YouTube added shorts because it's like, hey, why do TikTok when you can do YouTube shorts? But I think it also has a benefit of giving users the need to not have to have so many different accounts. But it's just something to think about. I don't think they have to have blog posts, but it's a good idea. Now, PixelFed, on the other hand, has been wrestling with the idea of allowing text-only posts. They recently shared a screenshot of the upcoming changes to the UI, and it strikingly looked very similar to Facebook. And me personally, because there really isn't a good Facebook alternative. I know there's Friendica, but Friendica just doesn't have that ease of use and nice looking UI as PixelFed. And so there really isn't a Facebook alternative. And that's one thing that has held me back from deleting Facebook altogether, because I would at least like to tell friends, family, my grandma on Facebook to follow me on PixelFed. It'll work just the same as Facebook, for example. Having that ability on PixelFed would be nice. PixelFed is adding groups, and so it seems like they're definitely going to introduce a text post element there, but they're undecided on whether it's allowable on each PixelFed instance. I mean, I guess the other alternative would be to have a PixelFed that's more like Instagram and then a modified version that's more like Facebook. Maybe that could be some sort of compromise, but I think they should embrace becoming more like Facebook, because all these other platforms are going to try to become more like each other. At one point, I had an idea of creating a website that would let you just do almost everything, where you can post text posts, share photos, create albums, create reels, even create blog posts. And then you'd be able to browse different timelines depending on what you wanted to consume. So if you were in the mood of consuming photos, you can just click the photos timeline. If you wanted to read longer, fleshed out blog posts, you can browse through a blog post timeline. Maybe you can just browse through all. And if you just wanted to read simple text, maybe you can also browse through shorter text posts. And I feel like that could all fall under one platform. The only scenario where I feel like it would be necessary to have a separate platform is a video hosting platform, because that has more specific needs. It's more expensive to host, YouTube style videos on the platform. But otherwise, you can pretty much do everything else on just one platform. In some ways, I think even though Mastodon and PixelFit are considered different platforms, because they both use the ActivityPub protocol, it almost seems like Mastodon is just PixelFit with a different UI, and PixelFit is Mastodon with a different UI. But let me know your thoughts. How would you build an alternative to the mainstream platforms? How would you define them? Do you define them by their features, the UI, the community that exists there? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you like my video, please like, share, subscribe, and I will see you all next time.